everybody. We're going to give just a few more minutes to see if we can get a couple more people to show up, but a lot of you have been here frequently now, so if you want to go ahead and enter your name, your group where you work, and your email into the chat, that would be a good place to start, and then we will get started in just a minute. So I'm sure some people will start filing in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to do like a bit of housekeeping in the beginning just to make sure everyone's on the same page. I know it was brought up in the past and Kathy sent an email, but most or all of the recordings from the past virtual gatherings, as well as the accompanying resources, recipes, links that Dan had mentioned, are up on our resource page on the local UMass website. So if you haven't been there and you missed some or you want to rewatch stuff, those are up there now. And then the last thing that I'm going to say before I pass it over to Dan is that we're going to try something a little different. We're going to still welcome questions to be entered into the chat as we go if you feel like you want to. But also everyone has the ability to unmute themselves now, and so if you would like to unmute yourself so it can be a bit more of a discussion or conversation, or if you want to ask your question directly to Dan, feel free. We're going to see if anyone likes that anymore, but also don't feel pressured to do that. You can just, also enter in the chat. But with that out of the way, I'm going to pass it over to Dan and Keith, who are going to be talking about some ecological lawn care today. So go ahead, Dan.
Great. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. It's a beautiful day, early July. The sun has finally come back out after a little bit of rain. And I really wanted to focus today on grass, lawns, because, it's summer. We're out mowing a lot, right? Certainly everyone in my neighborhood has been doing so. And I really wanted to take this time to really, first of all, think about why we do this, how we got to this place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the American lawn, because it really is a uniquely American phenomenon in many ways. And I also want to talk about ways that we can use our lawn most effectively so that it both benefits our lives, right? So that we're not mowing unnecessarily or unnecessarily using our time here, so that we can enjoy our time as much as possible, but also so that we are providing some ecological benefit. Lawns in general is not a topic that I tend to focus much on. I tend to focus more on ripping out lawns. So I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum today. Usually I'm thinking about how can we remove grass so that we can grow edible plants and other functional plants, native plants. But I also recognize that lawns serve a real purpose, right? We're here at my house today in Northampton. It's a house that I bought less than a year ago. So my first priority was getting rid of a lot of lawn, but I also recognize that I want to keep some lawn because I like coming out here. I like having picnics. I like using this space to play with my kid. We play ball, we do all sorts of things out here, and grass is a great medium for those kinds of activities. So I'm not fully against it. And I don't want to make anyone feel like, having a lawn is by any means a bad thing. We're here on my lawn right now, and I really enjoy being out here. So with that caveat, I want to just give you a little bit of a history of how we got to this place of having lawns and having a particular kind of lawn. And then we're going to move into some more practical advice on simple changes that we can make to really increase the health and the beauty of our lawn, while also maybe decreasing the amount of time that we're spending and decreasing the amount of money that we're spending on our lawn as well. So that's the plan for the next hour or so. And I do invite questions at any point. So please feel free to chime in whenever you would like, and I will be more than happy to address the question as much as I can. I am not a lawn care expert. However, I've spent a lot of time helping people improve their lawns, and my focus has always been on organic lawn care. So I will not be able to speak as much about chemical solutions, but I will give the best advice that I'm able to with my experience. So with that, let's talk about how we got to this point in history. So right now, we have over 40 million acres of lawn in the United States alone. That's larger than New England, about the size of Texas. Quite a bit of lawn. Anywhere you look around the world, that's an outlier. Most countries do not care about lawn in the same extent that we do in the United States. And this was by no means always the case. If you go back to the early days of America, very, very few people, I mean, we're talking about single digit percentages of the American population would have had anything that we would have had would resemble a lawn. In fact, the grasses that we think of as being part of a lawn are not even native grasses to the Americas at all. When the settlers first came to the what's now United States back in the 1600s, they did find some grasses, but those grasses were completely different from what we now think of as lawn grass. And in fact, those grasses, they were not really adequate for the livestock that they brought over. So when the settlers came with their cows and their sheep and their other various grazing animals, those grazing animals demolished the native grasses that were there, and the settlers were really desperate for more feed for their animals. So really early on in that process of settling, people started to bring grass to the old country and elsewhere in Europe and even Africa to repopulate this area with grasses that would have been better suited for their livestock. And in that process, that's also how they brought over a lot of what we now think of as typical weeds in lawns. Everything from clover and plantain, dandelion, all of those were brought over unintentionally as they were trying to sow pasture grasses in the United States. But those were really meant for pasture. People would not have had lawns in their yard, recreational lawns, turf lawns of any kind, till much, much later. Really, the first time that we see in writing that Americans started to care about lawns was with actually some of our founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, both were some of the early founders of what we now think of as the American lawn. Thomas Jefferson in particular, he had a chance to go to Europe and to observe some of the trends at the time. And what he noticed was that a lot of the aristocracy in Europe were becoming more interested in creating these type lawns that we now see. But I really want to emphasize that they were limited to the aristocracy, even in Europe, well into the 1900s. So in the 1700s, when Thomas Jefferson would have been going there, he was visiting aristocrats. He was visiting, the court of Louis the 14th, I believe, and this was when Versailles was being built. So there were really well manicured lawns, but of course that would have required a tremendous amount of wealth, because at the time, of course, there were no mowers of any kind. So they had to have humans doing primarily scything, get those lawns just right. They had scissors as well. So can you imagine somebody crawling along and literally using scissors to get the lawn just right and pulling out every weed by hand? It was an incredible amount of work and was only possible if you were, in the upper crust of society. Nonetheless, they were very impressed with that. They brought that back, and that's when we had some of our first writings. They started to popularize it, and it started to be taken up by some of the other aristocrats in America. But it wasn't until really post-Civil War that it became somewhat more popularized. It was around 1870, I believe. Let me just double check that figure. When the lawnmower was invented, it was either 1830 or 1870. I want to make sure I get that date right. It was 1830. Yeah, 1830. My apologies. When the first lawnmower was invented, and this would have been a real mower type, so has blades that you can push. Of course, not electric or gas at the time, and that really was the very first time that a person would have been able to purchase anything that resembles a mower these days. But the big push to create what we now think of as typical lawns happened post-World War. So what happened after the war was that there was this big rush to move into the suburbs. There were low interest mortgages being offered by the government. That was a big incentive for people to move. And of course, people just wanted to, to move out there with their families. And that was the first time that we see people really wanting to create lawns, their front yards. Before that, people would have had almost no front yard at all. And if they did, it would have been a small garden. In the back, they would have had primarily more of a functional garden type setting that would have most likely been enclosed. So there weren't really these public spaces like front yards that we think of now. So post-World War II, people started to move to the suburbs, and there was a lot of writing, a lot of advertising around lawn care. Of course, this was when golf was also being popularized for the first time in the United States. So there was a lot that was moving with that. And then really another important trend that was happening was that post-World War II was the first time that we saw the rise of the herbicide and pesticide industry. Before that, those products were just simply not available except to a few farmers. And after World War II, a lot of the leftover ammunition and war supply actually went into creating fertilizer and pesticide products, which are also based on similar types of petrochemicals. So there was a huge explosion in the availability of these, which created what we now think of as the monotypic lawn, by which I mean that it is dominated by a single species of grass, or sometimes a combination of grass species, and usually with the exclusion of all other plants, and with a certain type of even look and height, and all of the things that we now see so commonly. Before that, no one would have ever considered, for example, clover to be a weed, right? So that came much later, and that really, I think, was pushed by the herbicide industry. You might see some of my personal bias there, but if you look at some of the history of it, the herbicide industry kept creating specific products to target specific weeds, which that were not looked at as weeds prior. And then as soon as that product started to come into the marketplace, people all of a sudden started to want to remove it from their lawn. So one thing that I'm hoping that I want to get across today is to really just rethink what a weed in a lawn is. We might just pan down to my lawn for a second. We're going to look at some different parts of my lawn today. This is right in my backyard. We're about maybe 30 feet from my house right now. And I haven't really done a whole lot of work to my lawn. I've mowed twice since moving in September. And yeah, there are weeds in here, by which I mean there's plantain, there's some dandelion right over here. There's some violets, right? So very, very typical plants that you would see. But personally, for one thing, I actually don't think these look bad at all. I think they provide some interesting diversity. So I actually, aesthetically even, I think that they're quite nice. Functionally, of course, there's a lot going on there when you have that diversity. So as we speak, I actually am watching bees, honeybees come and forage on the white clover, which is flowering quite well. The plantain serves to decompact the lawn. The dandelion, of course, serves as really early forage for pollinators. So there are functions to all of these things. And I think that if we can keep in mind some of those functions, that idea of this thing being ugly or out of place really disappears. So that's one thing. Now, of course, a lot of lawn uses there's a lot of symbolic function to lawns, right? So there's a reason why, for example, there are ordinances and condo laws around condominium association regulations around the height and the type of lawn you have, because it is a status symbol for one thing, right? If you have a perfectly manicured lawn, it means that you have the time and the money to take care of them in that, right? And it also is a sign, I think, of conformity, not necessarily in a bad sense, in the sense that, as a neighborhood, we've decided that this is our common aesthetic. So if you don't have a very well manicured lawn, some of your neighbors may give you a dirty look every once in a while. Some of them might complain that you're spreading weeds to their lawn. So there's a lot of kind of symbolic value there. And again, I'm not trying to make a judgment call on whether that's a good or a bad thing, but just to say that there's a lot more to grass than just the grass, right? I think another important point is that that lawn, serves to kind of tie those communities together and to create that common aesthetic. So if you have, a totally wild lawn, I think it's worth, probably talking to your neighbors about that, at least explaining why you're doing that. And we are going to talk about some alternatives to lawn, but mostly I want to talk about how we can get our lawns both functional for our lives as well as functional for the wider ecology. And let me talk about some of the ecological impacts of lawn. And I want to just give you a few statistics. Let me just take a look here. I have a few written down here that I wanted to share with you all today. It's really important to know just how much of an impact lawns have. So as I mentioned, lawns take up about 40 million acres in the United States, roughly the size of Texas. In Massachusetts, turf lawn takes up somewhere between 15 and 20% of all cultivated lands. That's quite a bit. 30% of all potable water in the United States goes towards irrigating lawns. 30% of all drinking water goes towards lawns. That's a staggering number. Now, here in New England, we have more or less a fairly regular water supply, or rain comes fairly regularly. It's a little bit less of a concern here, but nonetheless, we in early May and really last week, we had almost no rain at all. Probably you all noticed because your lawns may have turned brown, like so many of the lawns around. At UMass, where we work, the majority of lawns were turning dark brown until this week, and then they started to green up again. So it is a real concern, and we're going to be starting to see more and more long droughts, especially at times when we're not used to seeing drought. Usually May, June are very regularly rainy times of the year for us. So that was very weird. And, maybe it's climate change having an impact on patterns, but whatever it is, we're going to start to see those trends move towards these drought and extremely wet conditions. So we need to be thinking about drought and how to prepare ourselves. And if we're using 30% of all of our drinking water just to make sure our grass looks good, I think that's going to be a problem down the road. And certainly is already a problem in more drought-prone states, such as in the Southwest and in the West of the United States.
Hey, Dan.
So, yeah.
I just had a quick question because that statistic of 30% of potable drinking water going to lawns was quite staggering to me too. And I have heard there are things like town water bans and stuff like that. So it's not like it's a non-issue to people, but I'm wondering why the push towards moving away from using so much water on lawns isn't more prevalent in common culture, like I think I would expect it to be.
It's a great question. Yeah, and you mentioned water bans. I'm not sure if they're still in effect this week, but Hadley and Belchertown, some other towns in the area, they all had water bans going. So yeah, it's a real problem. And why isn't it more prevalent? Well, if you're in California, you've been hearing a lot about this. In fact, there's a whole movement there, what they call drought shaming. I don't condone necessarily, but they take pictures of people watering their lawns unnecessarily, and they actually post it on social media, and this whole movement came about. And there's actually incentives in those states from the government to either water less or to transition your lawn to what's called xeriscape lawn, meaning that you're cultivating plants that don't require any irrigation or very minimal irrigation. I think that is going to move more and more throughout the country as droughts become more prevalent and more common. We're not used to that quite yet. We're used to rain coming regularly. But if that becomes a problem, which I predict it will, then we're going to start to see some of those incentives. We're going to start to see some cultural shifts around how we think about water use. So I think it's best to get ahead of that curve and be a model for change rather than reacting once it's already too late. So let's keep that in mind as we talk about how we can create water, water resilience in our spaces. Another important fact I wanted to mention is that more toxic chemicals are used on grass lawns than in agriculture. It is a higher polluter. Certainly per acre, we use more synthetic pesticide, herbicide, and fertilizer on grass than anything, even the common commodity crops like corn or soy or cotton or wheat.
All right, so let's see if we can.
That does not exist for gas lawnmowers. So per gallon of gas, your gas lawnmower is going to spew a tremendous amount more carbon dioxide, nitrous dioxide, and particulates than a car would.
Hey Dan.
Yes.
Sorry, just real quick.
Yeah.
The video and audio cut out and then came back. So the last thing we heard you say, or I heard you say, was that per acre, lawn is a higher polluter than in agriculture. And then you came back when you were talking about the particulates from a gas lawnmower.
Okay.
If you missed anything in between there.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler. My apologies for the signal. So what I had mentioned was that we spill about 17 million pounds of gas every single year, just refilling.
Hey Dan, if you are hearing me from your end again. Yep. So I think we got you back, Dan, but there does seem to be a bit of bouncing in and out.
Okay. Yeah, my apologies. I'm not sure exactly what's good here. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, but it does say that the bandwidth is low. Like perhaps Keith's phone's bandwidth is low, but we do, at least temporarily, we do have you back here. So
Okay. Well, we're going to do the best we can. And definitely do let me know if there's any issues. So I just mentioned a few statistics. The last one I want to mention is that as Americans, we mow our lawns on average 22 times a year. It's a little bit less here in New England because we do have a long cold season. But nonetheless, that's a lot of time that we spend just out here mowing. And some of you might enjoy mowing, but the statistic that I found was that when asked if people enjoy mowing their lawn, 58% of Americans said no, they do not enjoy mowing their lawn. So if you're like me, you don't really enjoy mowing all that much. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can ensure that we mow less and only mow for the right reason. Okay. So let's talk about what grass is really for. You know, we had mentioned it's great for picnics, it's great for recreation. So one thing I want to ask you all to think about is how much lawn do you really need to fulfill your function? And then how much of it is just about, you know, our maybe subliminal cultural norms that we've created around what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And once you decide, okay, I want to have this much, this is really working for me, maybe the rest of that lawn, you can start to rethink how you manage it or whether you want lawn there at all. You may decide it's
All right. We are working with what we got here, folks. Hoping that Keith can pop back in again. Something that, there we go.
Yeah, okay. Great, Mike, and my apologies for the technical difficulties. We're gonna see if we can improve the signal in the meantime. So let's talk about some low-hanging fruit, some simple changes that we can make to make sure that we both reduce the amount of time that we spend mowing and taking care of our grass, but also make sure that it looks beautiful and is as functional and ecologically rich as possible. So the first thing I want to mention is how we want to go about mowing. So the rule of thumb that I generally use is that you don't want to remove more than a third of the grass on your lawn at any one mowing. What happens is if you reduce more than 1/3, you end up really disrupting the grass. So I would say if your grass, for example, is 5 inches long, you'd want to remove 1 to 2 inches, no more. If your grass is longer, you can kind of figure it out from there. And that's really actually going to help the growth of your grass. Mowing is actually not bad for grass at all. In fact, if you want to have grass, you have to mow. You need disruption. Grasses evolve with grazing animals. So they actually thrive on disruption, but they need a certain kind of disruption. So if you mow 1/3, that's just right. That's perfect. The other important thing I want to talk about is the importance of leaving the grass clippings on your lawn. And I want to mention a few caveats. I imagine a lot of you do this already, but some of you might be using bags to pick up your grass clippings and then depositing them. And certainly making compost of grass clippings is a great thing to do. They break down really, really well. But what happens is that if you do that regularly, you are removing nutrients from your grass, which ultimately means you're going to have to add more fertility to your grass to make it, look as good as you'd like it to look. So my general rule of thumb is to leave the grass clippings unless you are removing a lot of grass at one time. So if your grass is really tall and you cut it back really hard, if you leave those grass clippings, they're going to shade out your grass, and that's going to create bare spots ultimately. So you don't want to do that. If you are removing a lot of grass, you do want to pick it up or rake it up in some way. Also, if you are expecting a lot of rain over the next week or two, you might want to consider picking up your grass clippings because otherwise what might happen is you might end up with fungal disease, again, especially if you're leaving a lot of grass clippings. So I would say, early spring, especially, or mid-spring, when the grass is growing especially fast, that might be a time when you could remove some grass clippings and put them in your compost or put them somewhere else. But certainly midsummer and even later through the fall, really, really consider just leaving them in place. That will not only help return the nutrients, it'll actually also mulch your grass, which means ultimately less watering. Okay. So speaking of water, let's talk about how we water our grass.
Before you head on to water, Dan, I have one question here.
Yeah.
So someone's wondering if there's a length that works best, that's healthy for the grass and meets the town bylaws, because for this person, there's actually town fines that come with letting it grow too long.
Okay. So those bylaws tend to be for significantly longer grass. I don't know exactly what it is for that town. The ones I've seen are anywhere from 12 to 24 inches as a minimum. So generally speaking, your grass is going to get it's not going to get quite that tall unless you're really trying to create a wildflower meadow or meadow in general. So what I would say is you want to try to ideally keep your grass between 3 and 5 inches. That's a really good height. That really both serves our functions as a recreational area and also looks really neat. If you get lower than 3 inches, you're going to be really stressing the grass, especially if you do have a drought, okay? So I would not go any lower than that. But if you go too high, what might happen is the grass will eventually fall over and will create a mat. And that's not necessarily very good either. But I'll show you. All right, folks. Sorry again for the delay.
Yeah, we got you back. You were going to move on, I think, to watering, unless you're going to jump ahead to.
Nope, gonna go right to watering. Yeah. So the rule of thumb is that you want to water heavily and infrequently. So in general, what that means is roughly thinking about an inch of water a week. If it rains, don't water at all, of course. If it's not raining, don't water more than once a week. Not necessary. In fact, you're doing a disservice to your grass by watering too frequently. What happens if you water frequently is that your grass roots have no incentive to grow really deeply because they have everything they need. Their water is right on the surface level. So if you want them to grow really deeply, which will make them more drought resistant, and very importantly, will also help protect them from grub damage, then you want to water deeply and infrequently. No more than once a week. And when you water, water deeply. About an inch of water is what you're shooting for. If you have a sprinkler system, that usually means you want to run it for anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes. That usually ends up being about an inch or so of water. So that's a really important consideration. I see people watering like 3 or 4 times a week, and they're actually harming their grass by doing that. They're creating more problems. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention was this idea of leaving some unmown patches of grass. I want to show you guys, this is my back area, and this is a bit of a wilder area. So let me actually just kind of tell you a bit about how we use this area before we talk about these unmown patches. So in permaculture, there's this concept that I really associate with. It's referred to as the zones of use. And that basically means that the further away you are from your home base, in this case meaning your home itself, the house, the less you want to utilize that space in general. And so your management of that space needs to reflect that. So, we just gotta, we'll talk about these goats in a second. But right around my house, that's an area that I use really frequently. I want it to look good. I want the grass to be fairly short because we picnic there, we play there. But this back area, which is maybe 200 feet away or so from my house, we use this area much less frequently. In fact, I'm rarely out here at all. Sometimes I'll come out here to play some frisbee golf. Sometimes we'll come out here to run around a little bit. And ultimately, I'm going to be planting some fruit trees back here and using this area for other purposes as well. But in the meantime, it's mostly grass and some other plants. And so I don't mow this whole area. That would be a tremendous waste of my time, a tremendous waste of resources, and a really big hit to the ecological richness of this site. So what do? I mow areas that allow me to come through here. So pathways, areas that might be harboring invasive plants, but otherwise I leave a lot of this area unmown. So let's walk through here for a second. So you can see this area, fairly short. Certainly there's plenty of quote unquote weeds. We look down here for a second. I'm seeing plenty of clover, violets again. I see a lot of red clover over there. I see fleabane. I see a lot of richness of plants, and that's great because I happen to have a couple beehives. You can pan over here for a second. So those yellow, red, and blue boxes there, those are some bees, and they love the clover and they love all the flowering plants here. So I leave a lot of it for them. But the other thing that I want to mention is that I really love the look of having these unmown patches. So when I mow, I kind of find some patches that I want to leave as, I guess I think of them almost as national parks within my backyard, right? So these areas, they harbor insects. In fact, I can literally hear buzzing from this area that I cannot hear from the mown areas of my lawn. So I know there's a lot of activity in here. I also happen to see deer grazing in here. This morning, I saw deer come out and graze in some of these areas. So I love that. That brings a lot of joy to my life to see deer, and we have porcupine, we have
All right, I'm hoping I can come back in just a second. I do appreciate everyone sticking with us. This is probably the roughest we've had it technically, but they should be back in just a second, and hopefully we can be on our way. Again, thanks everyone for your patience. While we're waiting for him to come back, if anyone can think anything about their specific lawns, issues that they've had, and then we do have them back here. So if anyone, we'll let you keep going, Dan, but I just re-prompted people if they have any more questions about their yard specifically, and then we can go from there.
And again, my apologies. We'll do our best to continue though. So having these unmown islands, which you can see here, and I did choose them very specifically because I like the diversity of plants, I liked the way they looked, and they allowed me to open up pathways that I use. So that's a really important way that you can minimize the amount of mowing you do, create more ecological richness, and yet also make it clear that you are caring for your space. And I imagine that even a homeowners association or a strict neighborhood would look upon this and say, okay, that actually looks really nice, it looks cared for. That's the most important thing people care about, right? Is that it looks like you are there and cultivating the space. So let's really quickly talk about types of mowers. Now, I know a lot of you probably have gas mowers. Here's a gas mower right here. They work really well, right? They're effective, but they're loud, they're stinky, they pollute, they gotta spill gas usually. So not ideal. If you are buying a new mower, I would consider a few alternatives. Electric lawn mowers have really come a long way since they were created. And
All right. I have a brief story that I could perhaps bring up when we get Dan back, but I was once house sitting, and they had an electric mower that worked quite well, as Dan mentioned, but I was not used to using an electric mower, and actually ended up running over a bit of the extension cord, embarrassingly. So had to had to buy a new cord before continuing the lawn. If anyone has similar troubles, I was just mentioning, Dan, that I have used an electric mower in the past, and I stupidly ran over the extension cord because it was a always to be plugged in lawnmower, and I've learned my lesson from that. But
yeah, that's a tough one. I don't know what to do about that. Yeah, so electrical lawnmowers are a great option. Some of you may have used reel mowers, meaning the ones that have these turning blades. Those are actually really good only if you mow very regularly. We're talking once a week. If the grass gets too long, they're not effective at all. If there's sticks and debris, not effective at all. But if you have a small lawn and you don't mind going out there for 15 minutes every week, reel mowers are really, really good. And look for the self-sharpening kind if you do get one. Those are really good. Now, if you want to get even further into the ecological world, I would say you can also consider raising animals, right? Of course, they do a great job of keeping your lawn sheared. So today, Keith was kind enough to bring a few of his dairy goats over. These are Nubians, and they are grazing very effectively and also fertilizing, by the way. So we're happy to have them here. Probably for a lot of you, that's not going to be an option. Chickens might be a little bit more of an option. Over here, I've got my laying hens. They're still very young, but they do a pretty good job of keeping grass down. Sometimes too good of a job because they do some scratching. So if you keep them on a small area, they will scratch all the grass up eventually. But grazing animals are another option. The last option I want to mention is scything. And I actually do have a scythe, which I can show you. Now, I imagine a lot of you are not going to be interested in scything, but if you have a fairly small-ish yard and you don't mind the grass growing a little bit longer, scything can actually be extremely effective.
Didn't want you to trip over the mower.
Scything can actually be an effective way of keeping fairly taller grass down. So you want to let it get at least a foot tall, and at that point, you can actually scythe your grass. I could do a quick demo for you if you like. This grass is not quite tall enough, but it's sort of a motion quite like that. It's actually quite enjoyable as you go. This is not quite tall, and ideally you would do the scything when the grass is a little bit wet or dewy in the morning. So this is right, folks. Again, so sorry about that. So with that, I want to open it up for questions, and I want to leave you with a couple other tidbits that I think are really important. A lot of people ask me about leaves, what to do with the leaves on a lawn, right? Because a lot of us are used to raking it up. My advice when it comes to leaves is if you have a decent mulch lawnmower, and there are certain lawnmowers that are much better at mulching than others, it is a fantastic idea in terms of creating a real richness in the soil of your lawn to actually integrate the leaf clippings right on the surface. Now, that really works in the early fall when the leaves are just kind of starting to fall. So if you can, just leave them right in place, go through them, mulch them up right there. And that basically creates a compost in place. So that's a really, really important way that we can add to the soil life and reduce the amount of fertilizer we use. And speaking of fertilizer, my advice is move away from fertilizer altogether and instead apply a top dressing of compost or compost tea once a year in the fall or the spring. Fall is even better. And basically what that means is that you want to add just a sprinkle. You can even go by hand, a little bit, maybe a 1/4 inch of compost, and then you can either work it in with a rake or you could just kind of let it be right on the surface and let the water bring it in. And that's going to feed the soil, which ultimately will feed your grass without having to use any fertilizer whatsoever. So that's a really good way of easily increasing the health, the greenness, and the vigor of your lawn. A couple other ways that I want to offer you can do so. If you have kind of heavier soil, so clay soils, or if you just see a lot of water running along your lawn, very important to aerate your lawn every year or two. Now, there are ways that you can actually do that by getting a mechanical aerator, which takes kind of pours out. That's what most landscapers use. But a very easy way of doing that, which again, you're only doing this once or twice a year, so it's not a huge time investment. Just grab a garden fork and stick it in and wiggle it about a little bit, about every maybe foot or so. And the deeper you can get it, the better. So that's pretty much all I do. And if you have really bad drainage, what you can do is actually take some sand and work it into those holes and just kind of rake it in. And that will increase the drainage dramatically. Because what grass hates is really compacted soil. So especially in areas that you're walking over frequently, on pathways, or where you're hanging out with your family, I do recommend aerating once every year or two, and you'll notice a huge growth spurt the following spring. If you do it in the fall, or if you do it in the spring, you'll see it that season, because it really helps the grassroots find their way in. So that's the other thing. And then the last thing I want to offer is dethatching as another option for really increasing the vigor and the greenness of your grass. Now, dethatching, I don't know where I left my rake here, but basically it's the process of removing dead grass from the surface, which allows new grass to spring up and basically gives the grass that is starting to come up more access to sunlight and water and removes the amount of fungal disease. So basically what I do is I take a hard rake, so not one that you would use for leaves, but a hard garden rake, and just go through and pick up all of the brown grass and put that in your compost or somewhere out in a bag if you'd like. And you'll notice a very quick increase in the amount of grass that grows right after you do that. So after, as soon as you go through and dethatch, it might look a little sparse, but it will fill in very, very quickly, I promise you. So between aeration, dethatching, compost applications, again, those are all something you would want to do at most once a year. That's going to really, really rapidly rebuild your lawn. If you're finding that it's kind of, blotchy, if it has poor growth rates right now, if it's not looking very green, those are some great strategies to think about as well. So with that, I want to see if you all have any questions or any thoughts, ideas.
Yeah,
If not,
so we have someone passing on their kudos to you because they were going through the struggles of having a battery powered mower and how slow going that was. But one question that that I had, I've heard you mentioned a couple times, but could you just clarify exactly what a compost tea is
yeah,
versus? Yeah.
yeah. Thank you for that, Tyler. So compost tea is basically it's a aerobic brew that's made by taking some finished compost. And usually, if you're making it at home, some of you might be interested in this, some of you may not be, but you want to put it in something that's going to keep it aerobic. Usually, what people do is they'll take a little pump that you can get that usually would go into an aquarium. You put it into a 5-gallon bucket. You put some compost in there and water, and it brews. Some people add molasses because that feeds the microbes. But what you're really creating is a very microbially rich tea that you can make with just a little bit of compost. So if you don't have much compost, it's a great way of doing that. And then you're either putting it on with a watering can or with a sprayer of some kind. So it's a way of taking a little bit of compost and spreading it very, very quickly and really rapidly bringing a lot of microbial life to the soil, which means that your grass will have more access to nutrients, and so we'll create a lot of vigor really quickly. Now, you can also ask a landscaper to do that. A lot of organically minded landscapers now provide compost tea as a service. You can buy compost tea in a lot of places now, so it's a great way of doing that. Or again, you could just get compost that's fully finished and just sprinkle it kind of haphazardly. It's a great time to do that in the fall, and that way it'll settle in over the winter, and you won't have to add any fertilizer at all. That's all you're going to need, and it's going to create a lot more life in the soil. It ultimately means more grass, more diversity, and less work for you.
Great. All right, so we're coming up on time here. So if anyone has any final questions, feel free. But if not, we had some technical difficulties there. So again, I do appreciate everyone sticking through those with us. But there's still some great information that came through from you, Dan. So I don't know if you have any last things to say, by all means. But if not, we can wrap it up. And thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I'll just end with a thought that you should enjoy your lawn, right? If you're not enjoying your lawn, I would really reconsider why you have it there in the first place. And I know that might not be an option for some folks, but I really think that we're at the cusp of a cultural revolution where people are starting to question some of our assumptions. So if you're interested in really rethinking that, be at the forefront of that revolution and make sure that whatever your landscape might be, that it works for you and it works for the wider world, right? Because that's ultimately what we're here for. It's not just about keeping it looking good to please our neighbors. So let's really rethink why we're doing what we're doing and make sure we're having a good time while we do it. So thank you all for tuning in today. Have a wonderful summer, and I'll see you back here soon.